Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I know the semifinals are going on. It's a lot of excitement this week. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge and thank first Dr. Karen Caldwell at SUNY Potsdam for introducing me to the science of learning. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the learning scientists, who I don't know personally. They're Drs. Jana Weinstein and Megan Sumeraki. And these strategies were originally sourced from their research and writing. And of course, I'd like to thank my wife Jessica for her constant support. So these 6 strategies have existed in various forms and by various names for many years. They did not originate with me, nor are they particularly new ideas. They've been studied, researched, and used in experiments by psychologists and other experts who study how we learn. These strategies have also been used by educators of many subjects outside of music to great success, but still many teachers are not aware of them. There's a disconnect between researchers and educators. The findings of cognitive scientists are not directly shared with teachers. As music educators, we should be keeping ourselves informed on the latest research in the science of learning, implementing these strategies through evidence-informed teaching, and sharing our work and results with our colleagues. My aims are, first, to establish and define what these strategies are. Second, propose ways music educators, specifically those of us who teach applied lessons, can utilize these strategies. And third, help bring classical guitar educators into the larger conversation on modern educational strategies in order to keep guitar pedagogy growing. So what are these 6 strategies? So they're retrieval practice, spaced practice, interleaving, elaborative interrogation, concrete examples, and dual coding. These 6 strategies can be applied based on 4 learning variables, starting with learning conditions, which include aspects of the learning environment, such as whether learning takes place alone or in a group. Student characteristics, including age, ability, and level of prior knowledge. Materials, which vary in range from simple concepts like notes and rhythms to complex post-tonal works, imitative counterpoint, and so on. And criterion tasks that include different outcome measures that are relevant to student achievement, such as tasks related to memory, problem solving, and comprehension. Each one has been or can be adapted for classical guitar pedagogy. In some cases, over the course of my research on each strategy, the ways that other educators, researchers have utilized these were so useful that I took them for my own without needing to alter them. And in each case, I'll attribute proper sources. I encourage all of you to continue to build on anything you take away from today, whether it's further reading on educational practices, networking with educators, even with those from outside our field. Or you may find that you already use some of these strategies, but need fresh solutions to challenges you encounter in your teaching. So first is retrieval practice. And I really like this quote, "Memory is the residue of thought," from Daniel Willingham. Learning involves more than just memorizing or internalizing information. In our case, this information is the multi-dimensional thing we call music. What we tend to think of when we assume something is learned is that it has been internalized, but that's only 1 or maybe 2 steps of the learning process. So here's an example I came across. I liked it and it applies, so I'm going to use it. I'd like you to think about how you got here today, or going anywhere that you're not familiar with. On your first day, you likely had to have help find your way around. In fact, we were so lost this morning, you can tell. By the second time you came here, you were told how to get around, remember where all the rooms are. And by the 3rd day, you were probably so knowledgeable about how to get around, you were offering to help anybody who looked lost. This happened because you were practicing retrieval. Retrieval practice involves accessing memories, accessing information and bringing that information to mind. It goes beyond simply memorizing. And there are 3 basic stages to the learning process. So first is encoding. That's your initial learning when information goes into your working memory or short-term memory. Second is consolidation or storage. That information is connected to prior knowledge and goes into your long-term memory. And finally, retrieval. That information in long-term memory is accessed and brought to mind. And educators tend to focus a lot on getting information into students' heads, when we should be giving equal attention to getting that information out of their heads. Out, not in the sense that it's forgotten, but out in the sense that it's being used, like a tool out of a toolbox. So information in our minds isn't stored verbatim, like it is on a computer hard drive. Information in our long-term memories is fluid. Every time that information is retrieved, it's reconstructed and strengthened, which leads to more durable learning and faster future recall. But learning isn't necessarily better when it's easier. Effortful retrieval, retrieval that requires a little more work, produces stronger learning and retention. Although it can be more frustrating for learners at first, this effort is what Elizabeth and Robert Bjork refer to as a desirable difficulty, something just challenging enough to enhance learning. Along with effortful retrieval, repeated retrieval makes memories more durable and easier to access in different settings, which is important for performing musicians. So, a few strategy examples. The first one, I really like this title, brain dumps. I was first introduced to these in a course on learning and development. When described in most literature on retrieval, brain dumps are typically short time sessions during which students retrieve and write down as much information on a topic as they can. The idea is to retrieve information without restudying first. So how can this be adapted for classical guitar students? So for my students, we use brain dumps as a type of inverted memorization. Instead of studying the score over and over again and then playing, students have to play as much of a piece as they can recall first in a limited amount of time without referencing the score. Why? Well, first, it shows each student what they do and do not yet know about a piece. This informs their future practice. Second, it builds confidence. Every time I have a student do this, they get better and more secure. It also helps them learn how to adapt to unforeseen performance variables. Brain dumps will certainly be uncomfortable and a bit challenging at first. Students might put up some resistance to them, but as with anything else, the more you have them do it, the more they'll benefit. It's definitely worth the effort. The next one, a very simple idea. 2 things. And this idea comes from Pooja Agarwal. We can use short, simple retrieval tasks to break up a lesson and enhance learning. At any point during a lesson, stop and ask the student to recall 2 things, either from the current lesson or from the previous week's lesson, or even ask if there are 2 points in a piece they'd like to know more about. Let the student know that this is a learning strategy, not an assessment of their knowledge. Make it something positive and helpful. A Leitner box, so you might know what this is. It's named after the German scientist who developed it. It's basically a system of 4 sets of flashcards. These are often placed in individual boxes, but this system works just as well without boxes. The flashcards have pieces listed on them. The first set of cards is practiced the most often because they're either new, too many mistakes are made in them. The second set is practiced less often, the third set less often than that, and the fourth set the least. As pieces become more comfortable, they're moved down 1 set at a time, so they're practiced less. If mistakes become more frequent in a piece, it gets moved up in a set. The underlying idea is that the better a student's mastery of something, the less frequent it's practiced. A retrieval matrix. This is an engaging strategy for any student, any age. Basically, just create a 6x6 matrix. Fill each box with a retrieval task. It could be a piece, a section, a passage, specific theory questions about a piece they're playing, general theory questions, guitar history questions related to the repertoire, anything you can think of that's relevant to what they're learning. And I use 2 colored dice, 1 red and 1 blue, and essentially you roll them, that gives you your coordinates, and whatever it lands on, that's your retrieval task for the moment. I only spend a few minutes on this when I do it with students. It can get a little bit out of hand, it's really fun. Retrieval charts. These are simplified versions of the retrieval matrix for students who don't have as much information to retrieve. So the first is just a list of 6 items, 1 for the red die, 1 for the blue. So you just list pieces, exercises, etudes, and have the student select it. And these can be adjusted as needed, depending on the needs of each student. And then I use one specifically for Suzuki students. So not all my students are in Suzuki. For those of you who aren't familiar, there are a limited number of pieces in each Suzuki repertoire book, and they're numbered. So for this chart, you would just list whatever pieces for their current book, or review pieces from a previous book, roll the dice, and the total of both gives you whichever piece they're working on. The next are exit entrance tickets. These are really great. These are used by teachers everywhere in many disciplines. If you type in exit tickets on YouTube, you're going to get unlimited hits. I first heard of them watching a lecture given by Dylan William, so a well-known educator. So I thought it would be nice if applied guitar teachers could adopt them. They're simple, but they do take a little planning. The one I used is modeled after an example from Kate Jones. In order to leave their lesson, a student must list 3 points from their current lesson and play short passages from the previous week's lesson or answer questions related to the previous week's lesson. You collect them, it's a physical thing, you just take it from them before they leave and use the 3 main points listed as review points to begin the next week's lesson. So ask them what the 3 main points were from last week. It takes a little practice for students to get used to recalling past lessons. And you may get some resistance or frustration, but these will only improve their learning. If you have a sizable studio, this can be difficult to implement for each student, and some may not be ready. So I suggest working this in gradually for those students who are ready. And finally, the cover and play strategy. This is a little bit of cued recall. It's another simple activity, and this one involves taking a blank piece of paper, make sure it's blank, any printing can be distracted, cover a part of the score of a piece the student is currently learning, make sure it's a spot that they've practiced and played for you at least once. What's visible in the score is going to cue the recall of what's not visible. And then you continue this process throughout the piece. So it's an effective way to internalize a piece over time. A simple alternate version of this that I do with young students is a cued recall activity where I play one phrase and then they play the next phrase. Or I'll play half of a phrase and they have to end it. So with retrieval, we want to create frequent, low-stakes performing opportunities. These can enhance learning as opposed to infrequent performances that are high stakes. So these are opportunities to practice retrieval in performance scenarios, but with little or no pressure put on the students. And beyond just practice runs of a piece or pieces at the school where I teach, we host informal workshops, which only other students are invited to attend. So there's essentially no audience, no pressure. And it's not just guitarists, it's multi-instrumentalists. There are no stakes in these performance opportunities. They happen several times a week. Anyone can play anything at any time. And the goal is frequent, low-stakes performing. Change the environment. When we encode information, we also encode information about the environment and context in which we learned. So students may be playing at their best in the practice room, but flounder in any other setting because they have fewer retrieval cues. To combat this, have students practice retrieval in different settings. Try different rooms, different orientation within the same room. Get them on stage if you have access to that. Have them play in front of other students. Invite your teacher colleagues to attend and audit lessons. This adds to their effortful retrieval. And another simple yet effective idea, again from Pooja Agarwal and Patrice Bain, is considering whether it's retrieval or review. So what's the difference? Retrieval is student-led. Information is student-generated. Review is teacher-led. Information is teacher-generated. So a review would be stating something like, here's what we did last lesson, and providing information to the student. If you swap that for retrieval, by simply rewording it, by asking them, what did we do last lesson? You have the student retrieve that information. So of the 6 strategies here, retrieval is quite possibly the most beneficial and the most prevalent. The other strategies don't work without retrieval, or they're used to support retrieval in some way. So next is spaced practice. Have you ever had a student come to a lesson less than prepared, not playing at their best, only to proclaim, well, I practiced a lot yesterday. When you were a student, did you ever try to get all your practice in a few hours before your lesson? Or have you ever had the experience of practicing too many things in one session so that by the end you couldn't really remember anything? This is what's known as massed practice, or more simply as cramming, and has been shown to have little to no benefit in long-term learning. So practicing the same pieces, the same number of times, for the same total amount of time, but distributed over a longer time period is known as spaced practice. And has been shown to be much more beneficial for long-term learning. So, for example, a student might do several practice runs of a piece the day before the recital. So this massed practice approach will only seem beneficial in the short term. A better approach would be spacing these into maybe 4 planned practice runs, so that one happens a week before the recital, another maybe 4 days before the recital, a third maybe 2 days before the recital, and the last one the day before the recital. So this will strengthen the student's long-term retention of the piece and will lead to a more successful performance on recital day than cramming everything into one session. And in this case, there were no additional practice runs done, same number. No additional time added. The only difference is that this particular student had to plan out when they were performing the repertoire. So spacing works because students engaged in increased effort to retrieve information after a planned gap or a period of forgetting, which improves the durability of learning. So what is known, again, as a desirable difficulty. Spacing doesn't involve any additional practice time. Things are simply spaced out over time. However, spacing does take more planning. And sure, musicians are at the top of the list of those who intrinsically understand that spacing is better than cramming. This isn't necessarily a new concept for us, although it might be in other fields. So how can we better implement spacing? Well, we can plan each lesson. So divide lessons into discrete categories and include time for review of things like technique, sight reading, rhythm, as well as time for review of pieces in 3 stages of development that I have my students put their pieces in. So I divide that into practice, polish, and performance stages. So in the practice stage, a piece is new and being learned. In the polish stage, it's learned and all the rough edges are being smoothed out. And the student's recall of the piece is being enhanced. In the performance stage, a piece is essentially ready to perform for trial runs and eventually a concert program. Revisit learned repertoire, etudes, and exercises. So many of us, myself included, are guilty of teaching a piece or learning one, giving one performance of that piece and never playing it again. But concepts and techniques found in learned pieces are things that we and our students need to revisit, think about, and process repeatedly. So according to Roger Chafin from a 2007 article on learning clear delivery and expert memorization, we encode new information in terms of ready-made patterns or chunks already stored in memory. For a musician, chunks include familiar patterns like chords, scales, and arpeggios, whose practice forms an important part of musical training. Distributed practice, or spaced practice, increases the speed of retrieval to the point where an experienced musician can rely on long-term memory to perform tasks for which most people rely on working memory. Also, the formal structure of pieces of music provides musicians with ready-made retrieval scheme that can be used to provide reliable and flexible access to their memories for music. Studies of musical memory show that musicians encode music in terms of this structure and by using it to organize their practice. So revisiting and reviewing are essential to long-term learning, since we use the mental models we've created as the building blocks for new repertoire. And get your students organized. So the first thing to organize is an itemized practice chart. It's basically just a master list of all the things a student is learning or practicing during a given time period. It could be a week, a month, a semester, however long. Having a written list of goals helps keep students on track. A weekly practice schedule. So this is something I use to help plan my students' practice over the course of a week, along with a short section for thoughts and basic self-reflection, which I'll elaborate on later. I have students write down, or for younger ones I write it down, which pieces, etudes, and exercise to practice in a given week. So I try to keep the newer things at the top of each list, and then that student is responsible for writing how much practice time is devoted to each item on a given day. And this is an example of blocking out days. So blacked out days are skip days, which I incorporate as part of their spaced practice, so they don't practice that particular thing on that particular day. And in this example, in red, Monday is their lesson day, and most things, or all things, that we cover in a week are played. And Sunday, in yellow, is trial run day before your lesson. So play everything once through. Instead of having another sort of practice day, you have practice performance day. And help your students plan their practice at every step. So the next 2 items come from Britt Kaplan's Practicing for Artistic Success, which is fantastic. So weekly time charts. Help your students understand how much time they realistically have to practice each day. So A lot of times they have these inflated numbers in their heads. Students need to have in writing when they're going to practice and for how long they're going to practice. So in this chart, they write down each day of the week, starting with their lesson day, then write down what times they have available each day to practice. So for example, on day 2, they might write down 10 a.m. to 10:45 a.m. and 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Those are their times that they have available. Then they mark down how much of that time they actually plan to use for practicing. Lesson days look slightly different. No total times are listed there. Then a daily practice organizer. Rather than weekly, we have a daily practice organizer. So this helps students organize the what and how of their daily practice. So here they mark down how much time they have available from the previous chart. They write down specifically what they're going to practice, divide the time they have between practice items, and write down specific things to focus on and their planned practice approaches. So this can take a little bit of getting used to, and it may not be effective for young learners to write all these things down. But the basic planning ideas can be applied to most of all our students. So a few things to consider for spacing. How long of a gap should there be between retrieval attempts? Well, it's relative. Enough time for some forgetting to set in, but not so much time that the desired difficulty becomes an insurmountable difficulty. So we have to use our judgment. Does spacing need to be perfectly even across days? Not necessarily. According to a 2011 study done by Karpik and Bauernschmidt, absolute spacing, which is the total amount of spacing over a given time period, enhances learning regardless of relative spacing, which is the amount of time between each practice session. And is there any benefit to mass practice? Sure. Mass practice has been shown to have some benefit when applied to certain learning tasks related to motor skills, but that's a little beyond the scope of this presentation. So one of the most important things we can do as educators regarding space practice is check in with students. We need to follow up with them on their practice schedules, how much time they're putting in, and their practice routines. We need to follow up with what they're doing with that time. We need to ensure they're using their time wisely, and with older students, make sure they're not overloading themselves during practice. So talk to your students and help them build healthy practice habits. Our next strategy, interleaving. So let's start with 3 common occurrences. So you might ask a student to start playing a piece at any point other than the beginning, only to have them tell you they need to start at the beginning in order to get there. Experiencing memory slips. So either you yourself or a student in the middle of pieces kind of forget, while beginnings and endings are crystal clear. Or a student might be confusing a phrase in one section with a similar phrase from a previous section. So students often want to start phrases, sections, or entire pieces over if they play a wrong note or have a memory slip. So interleaving is a great strategy for alleviating this counterproductive habit. So try not to just teach repertoire linearly. So pieces of music are like pieces of a puzzle that fit together in a certain order to complete the whole, but can be taken apart and viewed on their own. Interleaving involves mixing things up to promote long-term retention. Another way to think about it is just rearrangement of retrieval opportunities. And much of our work in the practice room is blocked. So practicing one thing repeatedly until it feels a little more comfortable than it did when we started, then we move on to the next thing. But this approach doesn't always allow students to think about what practice strategies might be most effective. It also narrows the amount of retrieval cues available for a given piece or passage, weakening our ability to retrieve information as we progress through the piece or through the recital program. So when things are interleaved, students have to choose an appropriate practice strategy, not just use a one-size-fits-all strategy that might not be as effective. So interleaving for musicians and music students can take a variety of forms. So we can interleave between pieces, so switching from one to another. So typical practice might look blocked or masked. One piece is practiced for a given amount of time before moving on. It likely looks like this. We've got 4 pieces, practice one for a half hour, then move to the next one for a half hour, and so on. But interleaving pieces, while still utilizing the same amount of time, might look more like this. You're still practicing the same pieces for the same amount of time, but you're only spending 10 minutes on one, then the next, and then another, and then another. You mix it all together. Dividing the 30 total minutes spent on each piece into 10-minute chunks with other repertoire practice in between helps promote problem solving by making students decide the best practice approach for specific passages over a more focused amount of time. We can interleave within a single piece, so we can mix together phrases and sections. So a single piece, for example, in ternary form, when practice is blocked, which is often the case, would likely be one section practiced repeatedly. So we practice the A section, then the A section again, then the A section again, and then we move on to the B section, practice it in the same fashion. But that same piece, if we space out the practice, might look like this. Each section is practiced the same number of times, but they're still in serialized positions. So we practice A, then B, then A prime, then we do it again, and then we do it a third time. Each section here is spaced out by the other intervening sections, better than blocking. But that same piece, when practiced interleaved, would look very different. There are still the same number of repetitions, but the order is a bit more mixed. Interleaving, such as in this previous example, promotes differentiation. Students learn to detect subtle similarities and differences. In a 2008 study by Bjork and Cornell, participants were asked to identify various painters by studying their painting styles. On subsequent identification tests, the group of participants that interleaved their study of paintings by different artists outperformed the group that blocked their study of paintings by individual artists together. So this type of differentiation is important when learning pieces that contain parallel periods or themes that return in later sections slightly altered. So we can interleave across practice sessions. A little bit of spacing involved here too. So this first infographic represents a student's typical practice day. So although the amount of to-be practice material will vary depending on each student, I base this on practice routines of some of my older students. This hypothetical student has 4 pieces, 2 exercises, and 2 etudes, each with 3 practice points. They'd start at the top of the big circle, practice item number 1, and practice the 3 points in clockwise order. And then when they finish that, they move clockwise to the next item, then the next, then the next, practicing everything in order. Then the next practice session during the same day, they'd mix everything up. So they'd still start at the top of the big circle, this time with item number 4 instead of item number 1. And the practice points are also interleaved. So instead of doing practice point 1, then 2, then 3, now we're going 3, then 1, then 2, mixing up the order a little bit. So interleaving, we can also do across days. And this next idea comes from Becky Green. So this is a practice clock. Combines interleaving with spacing and retrieval. So here, oops, this is actually something I'm working on, not from the student. The idea is to spend 5 minutes on each point. Then you move clockwise from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock and so on. The next day, though, you would start at 1 o'clock. The following day, you would start at 2 o'clock, then 3 o'clock, and so on, so that each practice point has the chance to be the new starting point. Starting at different points creates new beginning points for sections and passages, which enhances the retrieval strength of those points. It also avoids serial position effect, in which information has to be retrieved in a specifically ordered series. These points can also be randomized, creating different layers of interleaving. So interleaving isn't something all students can just jump into. Some students may need scaffolding, or a mix of blocking and interleaving. It's important to note the differences between spacing and interleaving too. Spacing is spreading things out over time, with the time in between filled with unrelated activities. Interleaving is how things are mixed up, and any intervening time is filled with related activities. So our next strategy, elaborative interrogation, or more specifically, elaborative interrogation, reflection, metacognition, and feedback. Seems like a lot. These are often thought of as separate topics, but these 4 things are interconnected. So first, what is elaborative interrogation? It's a process of connecting pieces of information or adding new information by asking and answering how and why questions. So first, let's talk about feedback. When it comes to feedback, no matter how often students engage in retrieval, they still need feedback to know if something is correct or incorrect. Students may encode information improperly or retrieve faulty information without feedback provided. It's important to note that providing feedback for incorrect and correct retrieval efforts increases student achievement. So feedback is essential for learning, but we shouldn't focus only on correcting mistakes. Students will associate playing music with negative feelings like stress and performance anxiety, and think of lessons as assessments of what they're doing wrong. For music educators, feedback can be divided into 3 categories. Correct, incorrect feedback, which is simple indications of whether something was done correctly or incorrectly. Elaborative feedback, which is when we explain to students why something is correct and how we apply that skill or knowledge. So, for example, when teaching students free stroke, after they play, regardless of whether it's played properly or improperly, we might explain why we engage all 3 joints of the finger in uniform direction for a full swing through the string, and provide an example of a passage played free stroke. And feed forward. This is an idea that comes from the business world. The basic idea is that we can't change something that's already happened, but we can control how we approach that same thing in the future. We provide positive suggestions, directions, or instructions to our students for better ways or strategies to approach things that didn't go as well as intended, instead of saying that something was wrong and needs correction. Then metacognition. This is thinking about how we think. It's someone's understanding of how they think and how they learn. One of the most important things we do as educators is teach students how to learn. We have to teach them how to reflect on what they know and what they don't yet know, and how to utilize strategies for developing deep understanding and higher order cognitive skills. And reflection is a means of self-assessing and reviewing on your own what has been learned, practiced, and performed. It's a useful form of elaboration. So here's an example of reflection self-assessment strategy for practice. And this again comes from Kate Jones. First, create a list of what's important to work on in a given practice session. So write out your goals. Then work on creating a practice schedule, so space practice, using items from space practice, with specific goals listed. Next, get to work using your selected practice strategies. So the 4th step here is where reflection comes in. Reflect on what didn't go as planned and make notes. Then those gaps in your knowledge in step 5, this is where you close them. So you go back to step 3, this time using what you discovered in your reflection to inform your practice. So elaborative interrogation is a way to think about things on a deeper level, enhance memory, and build metacognitive skills. In this specific form of elaboration, students ask and answer how and why questions. And it's important, in order to promote learning, that both the questions and answers are student-generated. The examples you'll find of elaborative interrogation in educational settings by far deal with learning facts about topics and subjects like history or science. But music students can adopt and adapt this strategy in combination with reflection and metacognition. So this chart here, practice goals, reflection, and elaboration. It's a good way to incorporate all of these things. First, write out your goals. So this is the metacognitive component. You're going to write out what you know, what you don't know, what you think will go well, what you think might need work. Next, after you play, use simple indications. Check mark if it went well, X if it didn't, to indicate whether these goals were met on that day. Then, reflect and write about what happened, what went well, and what didn't. And finally, here's the chance for elaborative interrogation. Students cogitate on why they might not have met certain goals, and how they can potentially use different strategies for their practice. It's important to encourage students to elaborate on why certain goals were achieved as well. This helps them develop deeper understanding of the music, strengthens their metacognitive skills, and deepens their understanding of their own play. And it doesn't always need to be written. Elaborative interrogation can just be a simple thought process. So our next strategy, concrete examples. So we often have to find ways to teach abstract concepts. So linking concepts to more familiar ideas is a helpful way to do this. Using concrete examples gives learners more definitive means of understanding an abstract concept. However, using just a single example might not build the kind of understanding we're aiming for. Using multiple examples is oftentimes the best approach. So many musical concepts we teach to our students are abstract. Think about trying to explain to a young beginner what a beat is, what a scale is, or what it means to be in a key. Relating abstract ideas to examples of things more familiar to students make these abstract ideas easier to understand. So some examples of what we might do is tapping the beat while a student plays, and vice versa. Have them tap the beat while you play. The physical manifestation of the beat is much easier to understand for any student than a verbal description of what it would be. Sing the melody, so that makes it real for them, and it makes sense of pitch and rhythm. Vocalize rhythms with syllables, so for example, the kodai, ta, ti, ti, or music mind games of blue jello, so that makes sense of these abstract ideas. Visualize things. So I use shapes to help students visualize hand positions, like straight lines for left-hand fingers above the strings. Or for young students, I use the term cloud fingers. Create storylines. So I was working with a student recently who was having trouble with legato. He was playing Yesu, Joy of Man's Desire, and pausing between each beat. So I tried everything. I tried verbally describing what legato was, tried playing the passages for him so he could hear, but nothing worked, until we created a storyline for a piece. So each phrase was a sentence in the story, and it worked. Using analogies, so this is my favorite thing to do. A few examples like park the car for the use of rubato, or explaining harmonic function as the solar system, with sun as the tonic. Or, one of my favorites, is the analogy of a sculptor chiseling a figure out of marble, used for learning new pieces. So each part gradually starts to take shape one at a time, and over time all the details start to emerge, but you don't make progress on each part at the same rate. By the end though, when you put in the work everywhere in the piece, you have something beautiful. So it's important for music educators to introduce concepts, techniques, and repertoire in graded ways. This allows students to connect what they already know to new material meant to expand their knowledge and skills. This gradation builds schema, or mental framework, and previously learned pieces and techniques used become mental models or chunks of information when we then use as concrete examples. So we might tell a student this new piece is in the same key as another piece we've played, relating that new piece with the principal positions used for a given key. Or we might say that this piece uses the same techniques that we learned in such and such piece, relating it to a specific manner of playing. So it's important that we use examples that help the student understand the concept being taught on a deep level, since they may focus on the surface features of the example initially. It's also important to use multiple examples where necessary to make connections to the to-be-learned concept. And our final strategy, dual coding. So this strategy, originally proposed in the 1970s by Alan Pivio, centers around the idea that visual descriptors, or relevant images, combined with verbal descriptors, written or spoken, strengthen memory by creating multiple channels of retrieval cues and better memory triggers. So essentially combining images and words. So it's important that the images are relevant to the to-be-learned information and relatively simple, easy to understand. Images should not be distracting. You can draw these by hand. It's not important to be a great artist. I'm not. The artistic quality of the images doesn't matter. It's their relevance to what's being learned that does. Formatting is important. Images and text should be organized in logical ways. So our eyes are drawn to certain things, uniformity in particular. When using images and text, the text shouldn't be too overwhelming. So here's an example of images and text, the 6 strategies that we're talking about today. So they're listed, given brief definitions with condensed to-the-point text, and each has a single relevant image attached. The second is from a presentation that I gave on guitar technique and included Aaron Shearer's 4 principles of efficient muscle function. Again, each one is listed, defined, and has a relevant image attached. So infographics are great for dual coding. Dual coding doesn't always have to include images. It could just be arrows linking one idea on a page to another. It could be a graphic layout of a process. So here's some how to form laid out as a process. So we start with 3 principal sections, followed by their component sections, and then finally the function of each one. So with continued growth in technology, dual coding has expanded into multimedia learning, in which videos, animations, and interactivity play significant roles in learning. Again, it's important that all the components are relevant to what's being learned and are not superfluous. The components have meaning, they don't just make things look nice. And this is something I've created and used as an example of multimedia learning. So it's an interactive kiosk on Benjamin Britten's Nocturnal. In it, there are images combined with text, videos, and clickable content. I found that even the non-musicians I've shown this to remember a bit of what they learned from it. So you can click on each guitar. It brings you to information on the piece, a little bit on John Dowland. You can return home, information on the history of the piece, just little bullet points. There's links to videos, Bream talking about his relationship with Britten and the history of the Nocturnal. I'm not going to play videos anymore. A little bit on the structure of the piece and some low-stakes quizzes. And good. Be a little embarrassing if I got it wrong. So these are, that's an example of multimedia learning. But one considerable drawback to dual coding and multimedia learning is the amount of time involved creating content when compared to the amount of time spent using these as learning tools. So more involved images or multimedia pieces work if you have a specific curriculum that you follow each year, giving you the option to reuse items year after year. But for applied lessons, maybe more simplified images drawn in a score might be better. So each strategy, we can summarize the benefits of each one. Retrieval activities can be difficult to get used to and a bit uncomfortable for students at first. But when you have them students stick with them, students develop deeper understanding of the music they're learning and playing. They also develop higher order cognitive skills. And that comes from Bloom's taxonomy, if you're not familiar with that. Students are better able to bring information to mind, and this process becomes faster. One of the most important benefits of retrieval practice that I've noticed is reduced anxiety and better performances. Space practice supports long-term retention because of the increased effort each retrieval attempt requires. And the longer the delay, the more effortful the retrieval attempts become. It also builds long-term time management skills that are transferable across disciplines. Spacing also allows us to help our students build good practice habits. Interleaving breaks students out of ineffective practice habits that may only have short-term benefits. We're working with our students to build durable results. This strategy also has the added benefit of giving students new perspectives on a variety of problem-solving approaches. It also shows our students how they can mix up their practice strategies so they're not stuck with a single strategy that might not work. Elaborative interrogation can lead to creative solutions to problems. It helps students become more self-reliant. Our students become more actively engaged in what they're learning and how they're learning, which is also skill building on the metacognitive level. Concrete examples help make sense of nonsense. Abstract ideas become tangible things when related to something students already understand. They can also visualize their progress when we provide sensible analogs of where they stand. So, for example, we might tell them, you're halfway up the mountain when they're learning a piece. We can make short work of teaching things that might have otherwise taken considerable time and effort. And we have the capacity to provide limitless examples to our students. Dual coding has the benefit of creating two different channels of retrieval cues, visual and verbal, which in turn create better memory triggers. The addition of visual components also adds to students' engagement with the subject and enjoyment of learning. Long-term retention is enhanced by engaging multiple senses during each retrieval attempt. And of course, the point of this presentation is to better understand these 6 learning strategies and ways they might be used. But we need contextual understanding in order to make decisions about which strategies might work and how best to implement them. Our students are people with lives and busy schedules. And as educators, we need to know who they are and how they learn. So, a few tips. first get to know your students. Empathize with your students. Put yourself in their shoes. Understand your students' states of mind. Understand your students' social and emotional states, their family, home, and work life, school life. Know what kinds of activities they do outside of music, outside of work, outside of school. This informs our teaching, helps us work with each student to build good practice habits and enhance their learning. But don't allow yourself to sympathize with students. Their purposeful avoidance of practice, poor behavior in lessons, repeated mistakes without correction. Don't just say it's okay when something, a behavior, attitude, or a teaching approach is preventing successful learning. Understand cognitive load. John Sweller, an Australian educational psychologist in the 1980s, developed the cognitive load theory, which essentially states that our working memories, or short-term memories, can only hold a small amount of information at a given time, and instruction should be designed to avoid overloading that working memory. So we can only hold about 2 to 4 pieces of information in our working memories at a time. That includes both new information and information retrieved from long-term memory. Understand how much information an individual can hold in mind at one time. Don't overload your students with practice assignments, with too much direction in lessons per each task. Be specific about what you want a student to do, but keep instructions relatively easy. Don't overload them with too much new information at once. Know your students. Some will be able to handle more information than others. Beware the curse of knowledge. This is our tendency as experts in our field to underestimate how long it will take another person to learn something new or perform a new technique that we've already mastered. We all may fall victim to this from time to time. We're so well versed in performance techniques, sight reading, and so on, that it can be a challenge to view the difficulties of something that is brand new to a student from their perspective. Know that students will need your help with everything, from learning notes and techniques to planning their practice every step of the way, until eventually they're able to do it on their own. Support your students' learning. We have a tendency to give feedback on what has already happened. When working with students, this means focusing on the negative, addressing what didn't work. Instead of focusing on mistakes or areas of weakness in activities that have already happened, provide suggestions and information on how to improve while the activity or behavior is ongoing. We can be more productive by helping our students prepare for future performances by giving suggestions for the future rather than critiques of the past. These suggestions can be specific and can be given in positive ways. Often it's just a simple tweak in our phrasing that can be effective. So instead of saying, don't do this way, you might say, try it this way next time. Or instead of saying, you didn't play the right notes, you might say, here's a suggestion for how to approach this practice, this passage in your next practice session. And finally, promote growth mindset. So this is the idea that they can always improve or learn something. Veer away from fixed mindset, that they're already as good as they'll be. To assist in promoting growth mindset, praise effort rather than intelligence. Telling a student how much their efforts are paying off can help a student continue to grow, while telling a student how smart they are can often stifle learning because they might perceive this as having no room for growth. However, this doesn't mean we should downplay or insult their intelligence in any way. Anyone is capable of reaching the highest levels of performance, but it's up to us how to facilitate that growth and development. Thank you. Suppose we have time for questions?
Yeah. And I have a question too. It was a lot of great information, so thank you for sharing it. So my retrieval of all this information is pretty limited.
It's a lot in a little time, I know.
So is there possible to get like a PDF of this information?
Sure.
From you? I mean,
Sure.
maybe if you shared like an email, I could email you.
Yeah, let's.
I mean, I saw Lynn writing frantically.
I wrote like 10 pages of notes, but I
So
couldn't
it's
get
great.
everything.
I'm happy to share with everybody, yeah.
So how would we do that?
So you can give me your email and I can
I'll do that
send
at
this.
the end of the session.
I have a list of references for further reading if you want to get more into it. That would be,
I'll start with what you have.
Okay. Fantastic. I know it's a lot.
Cool.
Yes.
That was my question.
Oh,
I
the
want
gentleman behind.
email to you.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Find it.
Can you speak a little bit to, so the idea of a practice schedule
Yes.
and the randomization and blocking out time? You know, there are students that are very disciplined and dedicated and self-motivated who might do that with the, you know, the initial instruction. But obviously, some people will just be more attracted to picking up the guitar and get playing.
Of course.
So can you speak to how you've worked with that group of people and how you've implemented habits over time?
So, it starts in the lesson. So you have the lesson organized in specific chunks. And then you have them apply that, and with young students, having the parent there as well as part of the practice process is very important. So with young students, having the parent there and telling the parent that this is how we're going to approach practice at home is a good way to do it. I like to have students set aside specific times for practice rather than I have 5 minutes here so I'll practice. So if they have 4 to 4:30, that's their practice time, that's guitar time. And it builds that regularity so that they're able to then organize things within that time a little more like a lesson. So parental involvement is big, and it's usually the young students that have that kind of problem. I know older students do the same thing, but checking in with them, that point, that's really important as well. Asking them, starting a conversation and saying, how did your practice go? Did you do it this way this week? And if they don't, you just continue to work with them. So you, again, build positive habits. So you let them kind of not do it that way that week, but you tell them, okay, this is how we're going to do it, and let's continue to work towards that goal. So hopefully that is somewhat of an answer. Any others? Yes?
Thanks, by the way, for all the great information. So, like,
Yes.
brain's overloaded. Anyway, and you will get my email out.
Okay.
You know, I was thinking the society we're living in now, it's so visual.
Right.
And they're so stimulating, you know, I'm speaking as an educator. I teach privately, I also teach in schools, in public schools. And I'm trying to see how I can apply it. Some great ideas that I'm going to be taking home. But, you know, I love the whole guitar thing you did at the end, that I could see that working.
Yes.
My drawings will not work, that's another story. But, you know, it's wonderful. But how do you address that, you know, the whole visual thing? You have to basically go where they're at, right?
Yeah, exactly. You have to meet students where they are.
Yeah.
So creating content that's more interactive, I found beneficial. Even just Google Forms, something that they can click and get a right answer or a wrong answer or something like that. That's more engaging. And I've done some things like that. I've tried it, sharing assignments via email, via Google Forms that they use. So these more interactives, there's no feedback involved, and it's nice to have a little bit of that in a lesson. It can get a little carried away because that's the only thing they want to do. So you have to kind of spread that out a little bit and share that with them and let them know that we're not going to spend that much time on it. These are the things we want to take away today, then we have our next thing to do. So just keeping them on task can be really helpful as well. Yes?
Hi. Do you think in all these approaches, it's helpful to guide your student into saying it's more than just learning your instrument, it's about the importance of becoming a more well-rounded musician? And do you think that might help enable students to stick with the idea of, okay, I really will try this practice approach for this week, or something like that?
Yeah. I think the big idea is teaching students how to learn, and just using these strategies to approach them becoming more independent learners. So we're moving from pedagogy to andragogy and to hodagogy. So pedagogy is the teacher as the sage on the stage giving information. Andragogy is the teacher as the guide on the side, so learning is more student-driven. And then the hoidagogic approach is the teacher is more a consultant. Everything is done by the students. So I think these strategies play into that, getting the student from learner to master. So, yes.
Can I, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the challenges that I have, I'm working with all ages, and I typically have a lesson notebook. I mean, it's just the very traditional, it's how I was taught. I found the times that I've tried to implement like take-home papers and things like that, I've just struggled so much with them actually filling out, getting them to fill out. Parents don't want to be involved with having to fill them out. I've got a wide range of students. Do you actually use, because you showed a number of,
Yeah.
do you have any suggestions, like, or suggestions about,
Maybe we can
we have to
check
make
this out, yeah, because our next lecture is
Okay.